Paige was drunk again. She tiptoed into the living room and thought no one could hear her. Suddenly, she caught the vase of fruit with her elbow, and the green apples rolled across the carpet. One of them rolled right up to the chair where Mr. Wilson was sitting. He picked up the fruit and coughed loudly. Paige literally jumped on the spot from the fact that there was someone in the living room. Mr. Wilson carefully put the unfinished tea on the coffee table, put the apple next to it, and slowly turned toward Paige. She froze, then exhaled noisily and began to make excuses, reasonably expecting her grandfather to start scolding at her. With a slurred tongue, she told him that she drank just a little tequila with her friends at the bar, and they brought her home and it was no big deal. Mr. Wilson shook his head sorrowfully, looking at the unsightly picture. Paige, how did you agree to get in the car with drunken friends? What if you had crashed on the road? You're completely out of hand. Look at what you look like. If your mother were alive. Abruptly sobering up, Paige said loudly, with pain in her voice, "If my mother was alive, I wouldn't have to listen to your moralizing." Sobbing, she turned and walked hurriedly up the stairs in a shaky gait. On the last step, she fell, twisting her leg, but she didn't care anymore. The elderly man remained sitting quietly in an armchair, contemplating his granddaughter's behavior. He had long been tired of her antics, but each time it got worse, and he realized that he could not do anything to influence her. Recently, Paige had begun to behave very brazenly. She lived as she wanted, without any regard for decency. Her mother died in childbirth. Her father was of no use. After his wife's death, he drank a lot to numb the bitterness of his loss. He drank non-stop, occasionally cleaning himself up to see his daughter, but then he continued again. Several times he was treated for alcohol dependence, but each time he broke down. After another breakdown, he left town and left Paige to be raised by her grandparents. Mr. Wilson and his wife took the loss of their only daughter hard, but they had to pull themselves together to raise their granddaughter. Paige had always grown up in affluence and luxury. The grandparents quickly spoiled her because they felt sorry for her and tried very hard to replace her mother. Expensive gifts and permissiveness did their work. But Paige, in spite of being spoiled, was always a kind child who respected her grandparents. But 6 months ago, Mrs. Wilson died of a stroke. After her death, in spite of the grief that befell him, Mr. Wilson continued to work on his company. He achieved everything on his own, so he knew the value of money. As a young man, he sold a lot of things as a traveling salesman, and then he got into construction and stayed there. The man rose from the bottom, but after all these years, his health was not good. His age was taking its toll, and the perpetual stress only added to his problems. Big business was a heavy burden, but the old man's main headache was his granddaughter, who was completely changed by the death of her beloved grandmother. It was as if the granddaughter had been replaced. The 20-year-old young woman turned into a real fury who suddenly had a taste for money. She didn't work anywhere, but spent huge sums of money in nightclubs and malls, not thinking about the fact that her grandfather had put his life and health to achieve all this. And soon, Paige did an unheard-of insolence. She liked a purse in a high-end store, but her card ran out of money. The woman decided to negotiate, saying that she would take the bag now and bring the money later. But the consultant was uncooperative and called the guards. Paige, in a rage, broke the window and damaged several things. So she ended up at the police station. Mr. Wilson was ready to fall through the ground with shame. And after this incident, the elderly man realized that something urgent needed to be done. And suddenly, a crazy idea came to his mind. To get his granddaughter away from all temptations, he decided to send her to the village for re-education. The old man pulled out his phone and called a private detective, whose services he had used several times. Giving him the task of finding one person, Mr. Wilson looked thoughtfully at his watch. He felt sorry for Paige, but he knew that it could not go on like this. In the morning at breakfast, he informed his granddaughter that tomorrow they were going out for a couple of days and asked her to pack her things. The girl was not particularly surprised. They were often invited by his colleagues and partners. Of course, she didn't really want to go anywhere, but she decided to make it up to him this way so that she could ask him to refill her account later. When Mr. Wilson turned off the road into some woods, Paige became suspicious. She asked many questions, but the grandfather was silent and only gloomily looked at the road. After 20 miles of bumpy forest road, they drove into some tiny village of no more than 10 houses. Having stopped near an old house, Mr. Wilson got out of the car, took out Paige's bag, and threw it on the grass. He announced to her that he had bought this house for her, and now she would live here. In addition, he would not come soon and that he would take her telephone with him, and that there were food and everything necessary at home. After these words, the grandfather got into the car and drove away, while Paige stood with her mouth open. Having recovered from the shock, she immediately assured herself that Grandpa would miss her and would come back in a couple of days, and even would apologize afterwards. Grabbing her bag, she headed down the path leading to the house. Once inside, she was dumbfounded. She saw the humble furnishings before her eyes. There was a table, a chair, a shelf of books, and a bed. In the kitchen, there was a dining table, a modest set of dishes, and a gas stove. There was no television or internet in the house. Not understanding how her grandfather could do this to her, Paige threw her bag on the floor and sat down in a chair. Suddenly, she was frightened that there wasn't even a light in the house, but as she flicked the switch, she sighed in relief. Calming down a bit, she sorted her things out, sat down on the bed, and did not notice how she fell asleep. After a sleepless night at the club, her brain shut itself off, demanding rest. Paige awoke in early morning from a strange sound. It was her empty stomach rumbling. The girl craved pizza or sushi or something delicious from her favorite restaurant. Unfortunately for her, she couldn't find anything interesting in the pantry. All she had in stock was stew, vegetables, pasta, and some fruit. She had to eat a banana and drink water from the bottle. Paige had never cooked by herself and did not even know how to turn on the gas stove. At home, a personal chef always cooked for them, and he was just a magician. His tender stew melted in your mouth, and his pastries were always delicious. Suddenly, Paige heard a noise in the yard and went out to see. It turned out that a man in his 50s was chopping wood in the neighboring yard. When he saw Paige, he put down his axe and came to the fence. Paige tensed up, but the man only introduced himself as Kenneth and said that her grandfather had asked him to look after her. Paige looked angrily at the typical villager in a cap with a beard and returned to the house without saying anything. After 3 days of living in the village, she realized that she was out of fruit and she had to cook something. She took out a potato, peeled it somehow, and threw it in the frying pan. Of course, the dish turned out badly. The potatoes were burnt on the outside and raw on the inside. Cursing, Paige threw her cooking in the trash, and suddenly she heard a knock at the door. It came Kenneth. He shook his head reproachfully and said, "I thought you had a fire, but it turns out you cook food. Well, who fries potatoes like that? You look like a grown-up, but you can't even do basic things. Wait, I'll be right there." The man went home for oil and showed Paige a master class on how to fry potatoes. She grumbled, but listened. Half an hour later, they were sitting at the table and enjoying their meal. The village cat even ran in at the smell and began to move around the table, waiting to get some as well. Thanking, Kenneth got up from the table and headed for the exit. Already at the door, he turned around and said that tomorrow he would go fishing and asked her to prepare some potatoes for the fish soup. Paige nodded silently, not recognizing herself. Either hunger had influenced her so much that she had become easygoing, or she was just tired of being in this wilderness without communication. 2 weeks flew by without a hitch. During this time, Paige learned a lot, cleaned up the house and yard under the guidance of the neighbor, learned to cook many traditional dishes. At first, she waited for her grandfather every day, looking for his car on the road. But gradually, she stopped. There was too much to do at home, and she did not notice how the days passed. Kenneth visited her every day. They laughed, cooked, had tea, and Paige felt as if the man had become her best friend. One day, they were eating soup prepared by newly minted hostess and talking about life when there was a knock on the door. On the threshold stood a smiling Mr. Wilson. He came in and sat down on a chair, looked at Kenneth meaningfully, and asked if Paige liked living in the village. "It's quite bearable. It's a pity there's no TV or internet, and from entertainment, only cooking and cleaning. Without Kenneth, I would have died of boredom, and maybe even of hunger," whether she said jokingly or seriously. The grandfather smiled and then said, "Well, it's nice that you and Kenneth have found a common language, because at some point, a real father has to start bringing up his daughter." Paige looked stunned at Kenneth, and he told her that he had recovered from alcoholism long ago, and he had gone to the woods to live as a hermit. He did not return to his daughter because her grandparents took good care of her and could give her more than he did in the village. Paige threw herself into her father's arms, and he smilingly stroked her head and from time to time asked her forgiveness in a whisper. But Paige had forgiven him long ago, and there was no need to stir up the past.